Hey everybody, welcome to Pelgrane Press's Gaming with the King in Yellow panel as part of Gen Con Online. I am going to introduce the other panelists. Let's start with transmedia artist and writer, published poet, co-designer of the Parasite alternate reality game, designer of Passing and contributor to Pelgrane's upcoming Black Star Magic and Yellowking bestiary. It's Sarah Sam Saltiel.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Contributor to Cthulhu Confidential and the Black Star Magic sourcebook for the Yellowking role-playing game. Friend of the Dream Clown, Ruth Tillman.
Hello.
Annotator of Arc Dreams King in Yellow Annotated Edition. Designer of The Fall of Delta Green. Night's Black Agents, Trail of Cthulhu, and Day After Ragnarok. My podcasting partner in crime, Kenneth Hite.
Hey.
I am Robin D. Laws, designer of the Yellowking role-playing game and author of the related works of fiction, New Tales of the Yellow Sign, and The Missing and the Lost. So we are here to talk about using the Yellowking mythos as first established in the 4 short stories by Robert W. Chambers in your tabletop role-playing experience. And we're going to, over the course of this, discuss Chambers himself and this small corpus of stories that has then sort of blossomed into a sort of community-owned greater mythology, and then talk about how I adapted that for, first of all, my book of short stories, and then this role-playing game with an eye toward how you can use the King of Yellow in your game. This particular approach to the King in Yellow sort of takes out later Cthulhu mythos elements that were added to it, but as we're about to discuss, the Cthulhu mythos and Chambers stories retroactively became intertwined, and it's probably where many of you are familiar with the Pallid King and Camilla and Casilda and the Lake of Holly probably all come through an awareness of Lovecraft and the greater weird fiction tradition. But in order to sort of get our feet wet a bit and think about the gaming part of the equation, I'm going to ask each of our panelists in turn to describe an element that you introduce into your game so that the players feel that they didn't just get a regular standard horror experience, but got a specifically King in Yellow experience. Sam.
Yeah, so I think the answer here is twofold. I think the first thing I'd like to call out is historicity. Obviously, a lot of Pelgrane's games have a strong historical basis, and I think it's important for all of them to draw on the history of the setting, but I think it's doubly important for the King in Yellow because the game is built with these 4 settings that sort of feed into each other. You want to make sure that the players feel like something is different in each iteration. Playing in Paris is going to be different from playing in This Is Normal Now, and differentiating the settings is what's going to make like the eerie coincidences and the surreal connective tissue stand out even more. So I'd say that like drawing deeply on the culture and the atmosphere of your setting is crucial for the game. So if you're setting it in Impressionist era Paris, it should be evident from like the way the GMCs interact with the characters and the sorts of clues that they find. Like every part of like the DNA of your scenario should be infused with the historical setting. And I would say that the other thing that I like to draw in is specifically the differentiation between regular horror and cosmic horror, which, at least to me, the reason that cosmic horror is so popular and so profoundly impactful, the reason that there's so many Lovecraftian games in the industry is that it digs into like one of our deepest fears as humans, which is that we don't matter. Like particularly in the States, we're very like focused on the Anthropocene, but I think living in a post-Cold War society, in one that's dealing with ongoing issues like global warming and now the pandemic, we have those like very sneaky, devastating fear that our destruction is inevitable, and worse, that it's like not personal, that the biggest threats to us aren't out for revenge, that they could just destroy us at any moment and we are irrelevant to them. So I think that's kind of the key to understanding cosmic horror, and it's that feeling that, in my opinion, is so important to implement in each King in Yellow game. The bad guys aren't like just vindictive. It's not that the PCs are special. The threats kind of just exist. They are, and the PCs happen to stumble across them and get tangled up in them. And that in itself is like the specific brand of horror.
For a little bit of context, the Yellowking role-playing game, if you're not familiar with this particular approach to King Yellow, has 4 books, 4 different settings, and it has a grand kind of arc where you play different iterations or reflections of characters over time. So the first one is Paris, that's set in Belle Epoque Paris, as we'll talk about in a sec. That is the setting of some of Chambers' stories and when he was writing. Then we have The Wars, which is set in a fictional 1947 Continental War in which weird horror things are happening in an alternate reality of war and devastation. Then we have Aftermath, which is in 2020 or whatever present day you choose to play in, but in an alternate reality just after the 100-year reign of a Yellowking powered totalitarian dictatorship in America has been overthrown. And then finally, This Is Normal Now, which is about our own totally regular, normal, ordinary, real world where nothing weird has happened and nothing in these books that I wrote 2 years ago has started coming true. So Ruth, what is your sort of signal element that you need to introduce to make something a Yellowking game?
I think the idea of appearances and changes to one's nature and subtle, I was going to try to use the word eliding, but I think the idea of morphing or changing into something, revealing some underlying layer that is horrifying, as Sam referenced, cosmic horror, it's revealing the known universe and that there are deep and horrifying things underneath the ordinary reality that we see. But I think also the idea of things changing and of not being able to necessarily trust our senses, whether it's because we didn't understand that someone was something or whether it's because we keep looking out a window and we're like, is that guy kind of like a big worm? Is that what he really is? That's horrifying. And so it's a very subtle way in which the fabric of reality around us is undermined, that's not necessarily present in other kinds of horror gaming.
Ken, what are your touch points for Yellowking gaming?
For me, it's very much building on, I mean, obviously, both Sam and Ruth's observation. Everything that I run is going to have a historicity to it. And part of the fun of bouncing off someone else's creation is to bounce off the specific times and places that they're concerned with. And with Chambers specifically, because his first and greatest King in Yellow story is one literally about a weird, unreal history that is called into the foreground in a way that it's not with Lovecraft or with other horror authors. The Repair of Reputations famously takes place in the far-flung eugenic future of 1920, a future that may not actually exist except in the mad ravings of the narrator that we eventually begin to suspect is not even happening. So the other element is building on Ruth's notion of eliding appearances, is that reality itself is shifting and history is shifting, and something that was absolutely not true is suddenly true. There was suddenly a play called The King in Yellow. There was suddenly, a President Winthrop. There's all manner of things that show up and have always been the case. And that combination of eruption into our world and a sense that they were always there waiting to replace us, I think, is one of the lovely things that Chambers accomplishes, possibly without meaning to, in the course of his stories. And I very much enjoy that aspect of it. And I think that is, first, it obviously gives you a great excuse to put anything you want into the game, but also it has its own specific flavor of reality horror that Lovecraft is to some extent almost the opposite of, because his argument is all of this is reality and you're just too stupid to know it. Whereas Chambers is more saying reality just depends on whether or not you read a play when you had a fever. And he's very much the sort of solipsist Berkeleyan philosophy, as opposed to Lovecraft's hardcore Lucretian, atoms exist. Get it real, people.
My own touchstone is reality horror. And that's the phrase that I've used to differentiate the way the Yellowking role-playing game handles the King in Yellow and his perhaps daughters, and the strange influence of Carcosa, and the disorienting effect of having read this decadent play, that the idea that it's sort of an interior mental space that you're having read a play can not only change your perception of reality, but perhaps can change reality itself underneath you. And the thing that I find interesting about the King in Yellow as an antagonist is that, unlike the great old ones, unlike Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth and Azoth and so forth, he actually is enough on our level and does care enough about us to come and destroy us when we make this mistake of reading the play, for example. And so the sense that reality is shifting under our feet, and particularly with the repair of reputations, the idea that a conspiracy theory can lead to a political revolution that is both utterly irrational, yet seems at some point can possibly succeed, is one that, as I've alluded to earlier, has become all too relevant in our real world, and one that I think has, if not certainly that story, the repair of reputations, has an interest in politics that you don't see in Lovecraft or necessarily in a lot of other horror works. And so my novel, The Missing and the Lost, is set in the aftermath world, and the protagonist is an ex-insurgent who, over the course of the novel, while also dealing with supernatural events, finds himself drawn, much to his chagrin, into the world of traditional politics. So I think that's also something that makes this particular brand of horror particularly topical. But to move from 2020 back to 1895, Ken, you did the annotations for our friends at Arc Dream's gorgeous deluxe edition of Chambers, the King in Yellow. And you found that there's been relatively little scholarship done on this sort of foundational figure of weird horror. So perhaps you could talk a bit about Chambers himself, and then we can discuss the 4 original stories that have later blossomed into this sort of quasi-literary folk horror tradition. Not folk horror in the sense that people are Morris dancing, but in the sense that all sorts of creators, as they did with the Cthulhu mythos, have added their own spin and adaptation and take to it.
Right. Chambers is born in 1865 in Brooklyn. He's from the professional class. His dad is a doctor. They sort of wanted him to be a lawyer. He did not want to be a lawyer. He wanted to be a sculptor at first, and then, discovering that sculpting involved math, switched to drawing, and was packed off to Paris to study art, first at the Académie Julian and then at the Académie des Beaux-Arts, which was the official a school in France that you went to learn academic painting. That's where the term comes from. So you could be hung in the Salon, the greatest exhibition of art in the world, at the exact same time, or roughly, that the Salon was becoming irrelevant. And that is sort of the touchstone to Chambers' whole life, is that he masters something right when people stop paying attention. So he masters regional fiction. When he comes back after writing The King in Yellow, he writes regional adventure fiction set in upstate New York. And then he masters the shop girl romance, which is the stories of young working class women who meet weak millionaires and make them better. Virgil the cat, by the way, everybody. Who meet weak millionaires and make them better, becomes a massive best-selling author, and basically never looks back at The King in Yellow again. Those stories come out of his Paris experiences and his brief time in New York's copycat decadent scene that was centered in Greenwich Village, where he lived as a single man. He got married, and as many writers who get married do, he turned to what made money as opposed to what was fun. So he moved past that and became a pillar of the bourgeois community. He was always outdoorsy and nature loving. He was sort of the opposite of the decadence that he hung out with in Paris and that he painted as the sort of innocent victims and evil influences in the King in Yellow stories.
And as a personality, quite different from Lovecraft, but it's Lovecraft who sort of is responsible for, not at the time, but sort of in the weird kind of delayed ripple effect decades later of, if not reviving Chambers' reputation, of creating this sort of cult awareness of these few stories. And that's in Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror and Literature.
Right. Yeah, Chambers, in fact, when Lovecraft discovered that Robert W. Chambers had written The King in Yellow, had written seminal horror stories that were astonishingly congruent with Lovecraft's own interests and beliefs, he reacted with shock. He didn't believe it. He said, can you believe, in letters, can you believe that Robert W. Chambers wrote horror stories? It would be like if we discovered that Jacqueline Suzanne had written werewolf stories in the 50s. We'd be, it's the same level of shock because he was such a respectable, straight fiction author who wrote trashy, meaningless bestsellers that no one cared about the year after they came out. And certainly Lovecraft felt, and in fairness, all of literary culture then and now felt, were middle lowbrow at best. So the discovery of the
if you
King
think
in
there's a lot of unmined gems in the vast corpus of work of Robert W. Chambers, you like a few things better than I do, but the gems aren't there, people.
No, they're not. I mean, the adventure fiction is it's worth reading if you want to read about the French and Indian War. Robert E. Howard basically borrowed a lot of the elements of Cardigan and that series of novels for Across the Black River and his later Conan stories. So Robert E. Howard found Chambers worth emulating as a historical adventure writer, but certainly the romances are they're not worth slogging your way through. I find his cryptozoology stories, one or two of them are good. Most of them are forgivable. Robin differs with me on that latter argument. And I think that I prefer his, I enjoy more of his second collection, The Mystery of Choice, than Robin does. But even those are not a patch on the first four stories in King in Yellow, which are a sui generis achievement for him.
Yeah, a lot of them are basically sort of Bierce-like, in which the person you're talking to was a ghost.
Yes, or Maupassant. The connection between him and Guy de Maupassant is very real. And he's at his most Maupassant when he's at his best, which is, again, in the King in Yellow mythos stories.
Right. And speaking of the mythos, the story we've talked about the most so far, Repair of Reputations, is the most Yellowking-y and the most complex and layered. The least related to this is The Mask, which is basically uses the King in Yellow as sort of a throwaway reference to a book, the way that Lovecraft refers to the Necronomicon, but it suggests that the weird events are sort of caused possibly by the reality shift sponsored by the book. And so what is that story very briefly about?
The Mask is it's basically a love triangle. It's a romance. The latter half of the collection, King in Yellow, is all romances. This is a romantic King in Yellow story, in which there is a sculptor who has developed an alchemical or possibly chemical preparation that perfectly petrifies living flesh. And that becomes a plot element, I guess, to avoid spoiling a 120-year-old story. But the love triangle plays a great part. The alchemical bath plays a great part. And then that character, the sculptor, is referred to in other King in Yellow stories. So the mythos is not just connected by the book. It's connected by the sculptor Boris Yvain and his career. And so the The ongoing King in Yellow stories have a feel of a mythos, which is another thing that I think that Chambers picked up from Bierce, and that Lovecraft recognized with a shock in reading Chambers, that someone else had done the allude to things and then never explained them bit, and had done them better than Lovecraft was doing in 1927.
In the Court of the Dragon is the trippiest of the stories. It's sort of almost sort of a hallucination or a waking dream in which someone in a church in Paris in 1895 who has read the book feels that they are stalked by a mysterious entity who is acting as an organist in the church he is in, and then follows him home. If you dial up the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast episode about that, it happens to be me who's on it. And then there's the yellow sign, which is the most straightforward of them, in which the King in Yellow comes for a vengeance I will not spoil against a person who has swore that they would never read the play, yet weirdly owns a copy of it and weirdly has read the play. And after that, it is in the world of gaming that the King in Yellow mythos takes off again, particularly in the works of the Delta Green team. John Scott Tynes and Dennis Detweiler write about him, and just as gaming revived Lovecraft, they revive the King in Yellow. And so gaming is very much a part of this subset of horror. And so I want to talk a bit, Sam, about the scenarios that you've written for the Yellowking, and how you came up with them, and how you made sure that they were specific to the King in Yellow rather than just being a horror scenario. Two of them set in 1895 and one of them set in the present day.
Yeah, so I think a lot of my interest, not just as a game designer, but also as an artist, as a poet, as a writer, is in the mundane. So I think going back to my earlier answer, I think cosmic horror is so effective because it embeds itself in the mundane. So you could be like getting on the subway for your morning commute, be like a very mundane moment. There's nothing to distract you except for like the music in your earphones. Like that might be the moment that you're hit with a wave of existential dread. I think that the mundane is one of the most interesting things to examine. And in my opinion, it's much more interesting to examine than the exceptional, because it makes it harder for the audience, for the reader, for the player to like distance themselves from it. And so with all of the scenarios that I've written, I think I kind of started with the question, like, what day-to-day phenomenons am I finding the most interesting right now? And so without too many spoilers, for Black Star Magic, I think both the scenarios dealt with like inherent weirdness of spectatorship and performance. And they were trying to combine the weirdness in this very like mundane act of performing with cosmic horror. So for example, like the This Is Normal Now scenario came at a time when I was watching a lot of reality TV. And I was really interested in the phenomenon that is reality TV. What does that performativity look like? Like what is actually going on there? And taking kind of this underlying unsettling feeling and trying to amp it up for cosmic horror. Similarly, The Doors to Heaven was written based off of like a real life myth that exists, because I think I just always find that the things that exist in day to day, if I can use those, are better than anything I could just create on my own, if that makes sense. So I think everything that I've written is built off of the building blocks of things that are already weird in real life.
And definitely art horror is another tag that we could put on the King in Yellow, because it's about a play that is never performed except in every scenario that a lot of people write about the King in Yellow, and so we have to make sure. One instruction I have to other writers is never do the scenario where you have to stop the performance of the play, because it comes the Phantom of the Opera pastiche in the Paris book comes a little close to that, but it's not the main point of the deal. So, and Ruth, you really dug into a particular aspect of performance and media culture in your scenario, and you built out a little thing that I created, sort of a stub in the setting. Can you describe that and how you went about making that into sort of an actionable horror scenario?
Well, I was really taken with this little page and snippet about the dream clown, and starting to think what media would look like in a society that's not just a dictatorship, because that's its own interesting thing, and not just very different from our own now. But what would it look like if American media culture had evolved along a track that was both extremely controlling and also extremely subtly undermining, again, those layers of reality? And so, since the mode of Black Star magic involves potentially using spells and magic and stuff, I started wondering about the kinds of traumas that could be inflicted through in this post-dictatorship world, through engaging with one's past, with one's media culture. And it sort of gets into, for many of us, I think, unlearning our own personal baggages regarding things that we were raised with, confronting other issues of our pasts. And so I really got into the idea of like what the dream clown could mean as a touch point for characters, how it might have caused trauma in the world, and what it looks like if it's set in a film's a news type studio. And so sort of exploring a bit of the thread of what it would look like for a news culture to exist under this kind of situation where everything's a little bit, or more than a little bit, unreal.
And so, Ruth, for the benefit of those who haven't read the book, tell us about the Dream Clown.
I would love to tell you about the Dream Clown. I am very sad that my own beautiful big clown is not here with me today, because I got rid of it years ago, like a sane person. Big stuffed clown. His name was Clown. I was not a creative child. So the Dream Clown is a character that's on a children's show on TV. And probably in school, certainly in toys and such that you could get. And I started imagining some of the ways that this could be woven into your life. And it's on the state-sponsored kids program where the Dream Clown tells you to, just let him know about everything that you heard mommy and daddy and maybe Mrs. Reynolds down the hall and Mr. Diaz, your homeroom teacher, say. And in return, you'll have good dreams, peace of mind, all this other stuff. And so it's just a very unsettling thing of a little kid sleeping on a clown in the art of the book that really, really stuck with me. Also, as someone who had a giant stuffed clown as a child. And so, yeah, it's like the idea of I'm going to use the word ratting because the other word isn't coming, but being an informant, the idea of being an informant, being a child informant, but adding this really weird twist where it's a clown, it's in your dreams. Is it real? And can it do that was also one of the questions I kind of toyed with a little.
So we have some questions that our Twitch audience have very kindly set out for us. First one is, I'd really love to hear the panelists discuss how much player preparation they've done in various games. For example, to use handouts from Absinthe and Carcosa. Absinthe and Carcosa is our beautiful Paris 1895 city book, which I took actual real public domain texts that provided all the information that players need about Paris. So why would I rewrite them? Instead, I turned them over to the collage artist Dean Engelhardt, who made them into this beautiful facsimile edition of a scrapbook written by someone whose mind was undermined by Carcosa back in the day, and that you can present to your players as a handbook. Personally, my group is not as handout oriented as you might think. Sometimes I've had the experience, especially now that I drop things into Slack. I think they like to jump in, know what's going on in the game, and they're not about doing homework and reading a big long thing ahead of time. And of course, when I was running my Yellowking game, I did not have this beautiful volume. It was just a set of files on Dean's hard drive. Handouts and Yellowking and horror panel. Sam?
Sorry, I was muted. So yeah, I think at least my preferences as a GM are to stay pretty handout light. And that's not to say that they aren't useful, but then I think that their biggest use is like choosing snippets here and there, being like, these are the few select things that I want to show to a player, and then familiarizing yourself as a GM with like the entirety of what there is to know with the historical settings, with the books, because I think you can then use it as inspiration and weave it into your storytelling. So I think that is the way that I like to bring it in best, because that feels the most organic to me.
Ruth?
I think when I've done things with handouts, it's generally been one or two images for the most part, something that would get the mind turning. So for example, before I did something that one of Robin's, I believe it was the one that I ran at Gen Con, 2 years ago now. And it involved the art student ball. And so I not only took one of the Absinthe and Carcosa things that had been provided, but I also went and found the clip from An American in Paris of the later art student ball. Say, like, here's an idea of maybe of the way that this would progress in our reality. So sort of think about what it might have been like in that very different reality. And so I sent that to the players and suggested that they might consider watching that too, getting an idea too for the enormity of the costumes, because I really wanted them to be creative when they started thinking about their own costumes and how they were going to engage with it. And then with the Dream Clown, I really, I sent that little handout flyer thing in the book and said, here, this is the Dream Clown. And that was really enough to make them concerned.
Sad
I think
and
about
terrified.
it. Yeah, they were like, "Oh, we grew up with this, did we?" Like, yeah, you grew up with this, and it was a really again, it had sparked that whole scenario for me, and I felt it really brought something out with them too.
And Ken, you haven't yet played Yellowking, I don't think, but you're fixing to, because you've been drawn into some research. How do you anticipate using the copious handouts you will no doubt discover in the era that you want to explore?
Traditionally, in my games, I ran an Unknown Armies game set in the Old West, and I imagine that the process will be very similar. Traditionally, what it involves is me finding a map of the territory, in this case of San Francisco in 1912, maybe one of Carmel on Sea, if that's where the adventure takes place. And then that's what I hand out to the players. The rest is up to them. And generally people will know what they think of Jack London and Clark Ashton Smith. They probably won't know George Sterling. But my players are all University of Chicago people and all have access to the same Wikipedia that I do. So,
and for context, you're thinking of doing a source book that's like follows on from Paris and takes those characters into San Francisco a decade and a bit later.
Yeah, 17 years later in 1912. So it's the sort of the second half of It, right? Or they've had their adventures in Paris. They're like, well, that's all behind us. Oh no, it's not all behind us. This is actually, the yellow is still happening. So they have to reassemble in San Francisco and deal with stuff of whatever sort. And so a lot of it is really just sort of establishing the very basic outlines of information that they would have. And that can be done just as easily as pointing to the map and saying, here's the Barbary Coast. It's a wretched hive of scum and villainy. And then they can go Google Barbary Coast as fast as I can go Google Barbary Coast, even faster, because I'm running a game. And then being ready to roll with whatever the players bring to me. That's what I think is a real advantage to a historical game. It's harder to do that in any other settings, but they can come back to me, as they did repeatedly in the Old West game, and say, this guy was badly wounded in an accident he never talked about later. What do you think that was, Ken? And I was like, well, that's a fascinating fact. Let's all explore it in play. And that's, outsource the handouting. That's what I say.
They were Kenneth Hite.
Exactly. It's part of the fun.
Next question is, I'm usually the GM in my group. I find when I run cosmic horror games, my players are often waiting for the horror to start and tend to want to hit the fast forward button on anything involved in the build. I skew toward a less is more approach in cosmic horror, as opposed to a Shoggoth around every corner, and that's definitely the approach for King in Yellow. So any advice on how to keep players interested in the build? Thank you. Ruth? the slow burn, how do you do it?
I think you have to really starting. So I would say two angles to start doing this. One is starting with, again, slight distrust of reality, slight changes to things, figure out ways in which that will advance or otherwise lead up to your story and seed them in there. I think that's a good start, so that they understand that the horror is present throughout, even if you're burning up to it. But then also, I think there's some room for either backstory incidents or other kinds of sidebar type things, where you engage with the weird. We definitely had a good moment where I asked all the players, like, so what do you remember about the Dream Clown growing up? And that was well into the scenario. And so that allowed them to flash to something that was not yet, we weren't yet at the super weird bit. It hadn't gotten super weird. So they were able to sort of flash to that. And some of it was very normal and some of it was kind of unsettling. And that gave them a chance to put their weird out there.
Sam, the slow build.
Yeah, so I think I would have a somewhat similar answer in that you need to emphasize what the stakes are. I think if the players feel like there are stakes and they feel invested in those stakes, then they're more likely to stick out a slow build. So like Ruth was talking about, in all the settings that I've seen, all the characters will have prior to the scenario, here was a weird thing that happened to me. And so I think using anything you know about the characters, any things that the players are particularly invested in, if they have a sister or a love interest or like a person that they've said is in their life, like bring them into it. It doesn't need to be outright horror right away, but like make sure that the stakes involve the things that they're most emotionally invested in for their characters.
Ken, do your players like to fast forward past the slow burn, or do they like to wriggle slowly onto the hook?
Oh, my players are very fond of tiptoeing in and then running back out over and over and over again. They go up and then they encounter something that makes Emily like hide behind her sweater, and then they have to run away again because it was too disgusting. So, in terms of the slow reveal, a lot of it is just to keep a slow but slightly increasing feed of things that the players don't enjoy into the setting. And if you begin with something that is unnerving and mysterious but can't have any immediate action except, oh, if you look harder at it, then you go crazy a little faster. Good for you. That, I think, establishes the building mood well enough. And if they just absolutely want to dive into the ghoul tunnels, well, that's what replacement characters are for. The cure to players who want to get to the fireworks factory is blow up the fireworks factory with them in it a couple of times.
The Yellowking role-playing game uses a device, which is also found in other Gumshoe games, horror games, to encourage players to submit the slow burn that they would like to burn in. And in, for example, in the Paris game, that is called the Deuced Peculiar Thing. And the other three sets of characters have equivalents as well. And so you specify the odd thing that recently happened to you that you can't quite explain. And that way the player is sort of buying into the idea of there being a slow build. And they're picking something that obviously, by definition, creeps them out. And so if someone is kind of afraid of gargoyles and statues, they say, I thought I saw the gargoyle move. Or I was at a party the other week and I can't get back to the strange dark manor where it occurred. And so the players are cooperating in the venture of having slow reality things starting at the edges. And I found my players also, like Ken's, are one of their greatest skills is being scared of things. And they will seize on something and magnify it. And often that thing is quite straight. Later on in the wars, I had sort of weird foxes prowling around, and someone mentioned that the cry of a fox is actually quite unnerving. And so we pulled up a sound effect of a screaming fox, and I just would play that at different times over the course of the whole rest of the year-and-a-half game that we played. And it just absolutely gave them the willies every time, because foxes are terrifying when they make that noise. And So all that was required to, whenever there was sort of a slow moment that needed a bit of build, was, well, let's just reach for that sound effect again. And so look for the little details that they react to, I would say, and that's how to invest them in the build. It's not your details, it's theirs that allow that to happen for you. The next question is, in your home games of Yellowking, what configuration of Casilda, Camilla, and the king do you prefer or use most often? I have the option of customizing the configuration of I love having the option of customizing the configuration of the court. And so for a bit of context, as part and parcel with the idea of there being shifting reality, that you are encouraged as GM in collaboration with your players to come up with your explanation of why this phenomenon exists, if you ever explain anything at all. And so the court can be portrayed in various ways. I think I'm the person who played longest here. And Casilda was very important. She showed up both in dreams and then later in reality. And also actually a legendary vampire, a Dama from the Paul Vaval novels, showed up. And I didn't plan on making a big deal of her, but because the players really hated her because legendary vampire, I brought her back as the character who kept appearing in different other settings, because in addition to the perhaps quasi-immortal figures of the Carcosan court, it makes sense for a vampire to keep appearing. Sam, have you played enough to know who you would use on over the course of an extended campaign?
I haven't had many opportunities to do so, but I think the experiences that I have had have told me that it's very dependent on your players and what they seem to be latching onto, what they seem to be struggling with. Do they seem like they need someone who's maybe kind of on their side, still possibly evil, but it is helping them along for one reason or another? Then I think that you should give them that. Do they seem like they are kind of uninterested in the politics, maybe don't go into it as much? So I think just try to pay attention to what they're latching onto and what sort of pushes they need to keep up their momentum. And I think provide that with the politics of the royal court, whether behind the scenes or made a little bit more explicit.
Ruth, how would you use the court in an extended campaign?
So I've been thinking about this because I haven't gotten as much of a chance to do that. And I think what I would probably do is keep an eye out for characters, particularly for the two daughters or possible daughters, female characters who have agendas and are involved in some way with the characters, probably at least to some degree seeming to help them, because that's sort of the thing that interests me is that trust issue. When you are dealing with a supernatural entity that might be using you or might be helping you because you further their ends in some other way that's a little less usy. And so I think looking for which characters flesh out, because I think forcing it is tricky. I think that part of, listening to what your players bring to it, figuring out how a person evolves, that's been the trickiest thing for me, is I have not been able to say, oh yes, I'm going to write in this person who is definitely Casilda or definitely Camilla or even definitely the king in yellow, because it feels too prescriptive for something longer term. So I think I would be exploring where they could evolve, where they could pop out of existing people, as it were, and where they might even start seeding into dreams to foreshadow that. And then how they might, that might reveal another layer of reality.
So Ken, another commenter on Twitch says, I was this many years old hearing that he also wrote other stories and genres, and I'm very interested in the New York history ones. Ken, how big a mistake is that?
I would say if you're a fast reader, it's not a giant mistake. I only read The Hidden Children, which is the third, I think, in the sequence, because I was misinformed that there was magic in it. There's just sort of like superstitious fear of the Iroquois in it, which is not the same thing at all. But if you are able to read lesser Edgar Rice Burroughs, The Hidden Children will not shock and appall you. And again, like I say, that sequence very much inspired Robert E. Howard. So if you are a action adventure horror minded person, they might likewise inspire you. I don't know that I would personally read. I mean, I didn't finish Cardigan. I got about halfway through Cardigan and gave up. So it's not a these are not mysterious, hidden, missing classics as Robin alludes. But I think they're all right if you've got an evening free to read an adventure novel. That's an adventure novel, and you can read it in an evening.
Jeff Cars asks if we recommend running the sequences in order or moving back and forth. I had constructed the game on the premise that people would mostly do it in order and possibly have characters cross over, or I had the Paris characters do an episode flashback when they were a little older, as in the middle of an Aftermath game, and then the next week the stuff that they did in the second Great Chicago Fire, which is alluded to in the Repair of Reputations, then became the backstory that the Aftermath characters were investigating. I would at least do a few of them in order and then move around. And that might be a solution too, if you've got a group that's really large and also the attendance isn't great. But in general, you will have to do more adaptation. But having said that, you can also just play any one setting that you think is interesting, right? If you love the Belle Epoque, you may never want to get out of Paris. If you want to do one-shots, you may find that This Is Normal Now is the one that requires the least exposition and information. So I also do assume that people will do standalone adventures or just stick to one sequence. But if you're going to do the whole schmear, I would recommend mostly sticking to the order.
This Is Normal Now actually freaks me out so much that I won't run it. So, I mean, well done, Robin, right? Well done. But the world as we have it is so horrifying and dreadful. And I said this like 2 years ago. So, I mean, maybe lean into that with your players. I'm very much like an Aftermath kind of person or a Paris kind of person, and would probably just bounce between those two, which I think would also work, just understanding that there'd been the wars and maybe even flashing to a one-off episode if you wanted to try that. But yeah.
Right. And the settings are all based on my short stories, New Tales of the Yellow Sign. And it is because so there's a story set in the wars, there's a couple of stories from the continuity of Aftermath, there's a bunch of modern ones. There aren't any Belle Epoque Paris ones, but that's the obvious no-brainer that you have to do if you do Yellowking. And that is both the advantage and the challenge of Yellowking, is that I didn't sit down to go, well, what's the 4 things that one group of people is all going to be interested in? I based it on my own literary work. And so as a consequence, people are going to gravitate more to one than the other. And that will probably determine how much time you spend in each of them. Next question, how do you handle it when the player characters read the play? Well, of course, I have an upcoming column about this, but the answer is that they've helped you enormously. So Sam, what are you going to do when one of your players tells you that they've read the play or finds the play and reads it?
So I would see it as a point of escalation. I think if the player's saying to you, I want things to get creepier fast, because like they know the ramifications of this. They know what they're getting themselves into. And so I think that is giving you permission as a GM to lean on the horror even more. Like if you were taking it slow, I think this is the sign that the player's kind of done with the slowness. Like we need to amp up the horror right now.
They're saying I want to be chased by an evil organist.
Yeah, well, I'm building on what Ken said. I think in some ways perception. If they've read the play and say the other characters are less on board with that because maybe they weren't quite ready to get there, I think that there's some room to futz around with having people roll perception checks and mess with what they see and how they feel like being stalked by an evil organist or something that doesn't quite exist, throwing in some dreams. But yes, I agree. It's definitely a time to put the pedal a little further down.
Ken, how would you ruthlessly take advantage of that?
I think Ruth has put the fun part in, which is that if one player has read it and the others have wisely not, you can use something that the role-playing game art form almost uniquely allows, which is telling one player something and telling the other players another contradictory thing. And that leans completely into the ultimate strength of reality horror. Is no, for you, yes, there's a giant slug-like worm staring at you and messing with your girlfriend. No, for you, no, there's not. It's just a guy who, runs the cemetery. He's not a slug-like worm of any kind. The players then get tangled up trying to figure out who's real and what's actually happening. And meanwhile, every so often someone could just show up. If any, it beats two men with a gun if it's one guy in a trench coat saying, "Have you seen the yellow sign?" And the other players are like, "No one talked. There's no one in a trench coat. What are you talking about?" It's just an immense opportunity to sow dissension and madness into the ranks. It is, as you say at the top, a gift, a beautiful gift.
And personally, when I ran my VAS campaign at home or when I run one-shots, it is often my agenda to go far beyond having the player specify that they've sought to read the play, but rather it turns out as part of the backstory they've forgotten they not only have read it, but they were involved in creating it in the first place, and that the reality horror starts with them. Now some players, you have to be a little careful that people don't want to feel like they were led by the nose to that. But since you have deliberately sat down at a Yellowking table, or you are my very tolerant players at home, you know that that's part of the deal, that you have, like the characters in the stories, you may have read the play already. And it just offers so many possibilities because any damn thing you want to have happen can happen. One of the great advantages of F20 play is in a D&D style kitchen sink fantasy universe, anybody can think of anything happening and it makes sense. That often doesn't work in horror games, especially very historical ones. But here, you can have both high historicity and also have anything happen at any time and then have it make sense because reality is breaking down due to the book. The next question is, how hard is it to run if you haven't GM'd before? What are our recommendations for Yellowking as a starter game? Ruth?
I think I'm going to assume that you've played before and that you've played games that are at least slightly in the genre of this. I would say with those two assumptions, it's probably one of the easier ones to pick up in that I found the fight mechanics extremely streamlined while allowing for a lot of great player narration. It's certainly one of my favorite ways to do a fight scene is the mechanics in this. And then much of the rest of it is storytelling. The skills in Gumshoe, I find Gumshoe generally fairly easy to pick up. And I think that the quick shock aspect has really, again, lowered the bar to entry. So I would say fairly easy, but whatever you can do to prep yourself for storytelling, for listening to and responding to your players and in their stories. And those would be my two real recommendations.
Sam, would you recommend this for a beginning GM?
I think I would. Yeah, I would say that it is a fairly straightforward system. Like, I don't think there's any oh my God, this is a huge mechanic that I don't understand how to run. I think I would say maybe if you're going to run it, listen to some podcasts where it's being played, because the thing when I was first starting to run Gumshoe that I think I struggled with most was trying to figure out the most organic way to give them the clues, since they're not rolling for the investigative abilities, which is the key part of Gumshoe, and is very important, but it needs to be done in a way so it's not Oprah style. Now you get a clue. Now you get a clue. It can't just be there has to be some suspense built into it. So I think listening to some examples of how that's done well will be helpful as a GM.
Right. There's a lot of good Gumshoe examples, but Yellowking is still pretty new, so we're still trying to lure someone into doing that for us with Yellowking. Ken, tips for running Yellowking as a beginning GM?
I think that, like Ruth says, assuming you've played any sort of horror RPG, it'll be pretty transparent. And I think also if you've played story games, because the streamlined combat and the emphasis on human interaction that's present in Yellowking, or at least in the setting, may make people who are more familiar with sort of story game structures a little more comfortable running it for the first time than someone who's coming to it from a crunchier system like Pathfinder or whatever. So I don't know that I would say this is, the best first game ever for someone to run, even in Gumshoe. But I would say that it's no more difficult than anything except maybe Fear itself, which is very, very very on-rampy as a first Gumshoe game. And some of the aspects, as Ruth said, the streamlined combat especially, are going to make it easier. There's going to be less bookkeeping, certainly. And depending on how you handle the card aspect, that solves a lot of problems in terms of character tracking and bookkeeping. And assuming you've got a suitable card mechanism set up on your Slack or whatever else, I think that once you've got up the little learning step, you're on a long, flat, beautiful learning ballroom.
Yeah, well, one thing about Gumshoe Adventures is they're very structured because they're mysteries, and mysteries have to make sense, and they have to allow the players the freedom to investigate within an existing structure. There's a lot of backstopping that the scenarios do for you that I think would really help as a beginning GM. So, and the core book has one scenario for each of the settings. So it gives you a lot to work with in terms of finding a structure that you can then replicate. Our next question is, if you had to make a fifth setting for the Yellowking, what would it be? Ruth, is something comes to mind as a reality that I left untouched?
Probably the 1970s. I'm thinking particularly the era of the burnout of the enthusiasm of the 60s. I think that the challenge in this, of course, is we had a very different 60s if you're in this timeline. So it might have to be an alternate 1970s. Possibly, I don't know, hook in with the fall of Delta Green and take that sideways. But I think you've got moon stuff, you've got drug stuff, which I think is a really suited era for it. You have your film stuff, which is really changing in that time period. So I think that there's a lot of movement in the 70s that makes it sort of the, bitter taste of societal shift away from a hopeful future that could really work.
Sam?
I think in that in that time is such a big thing with the King in Yellow, looking at the way these different settings interact with each other. I think the direction I would have to go would be a futuristic setting, since that feels like that's in that, like, I don't think there's a gap. I think that it does very well with these four settings, but I think if I were to build on it, to build another iteration, it would be a future. It would be looking once again at the consequences of all of these things. I don't know how I would implement it necessarily, and that would have to be done tonally very differently from Aftermath, which is, I think, one setting where you really see consequences versus this is normal. But I think futuristic would be the path to take here.
Ken?
In light of Ruth's comment, I think obviously any artistic scene that you know well, 70s film culture is a classic example. You could set an equivalent to Paris 1895 of people in the arts discovering something horrible underlying the greatest example of their art. So in the 70s, it would be a lost film from the 30s, a la Theodore Roszak's novel Flicker. You could do it in, the Andy Warhol's Factory, any art scene that you know well. I, by an odd coincidence, am doing a sequel to Paris called San Francisco 1912, set in the decadent scene around George Sterling, Ambrose Bierce, and a guy that I like to call Clark Ashton Smith, who's a young bumpkin from Auburn, California, just into the big city for the first time with a head full of dreams and a heart full of poems. So I think that that's a great possibility, and it lets you have a sort of a sequel to your Paris adventures, the one last job feel. I think another possible place to do it would be the Demoiselle d'Is era of medieval Brittany or late 15th century Brittany, where you're doing the Yellowking, but as the fairy tales that will be coalesced by the unknown author of the play into his play. So you're setting down the precursors where, the assistant falconer's name is Hastur. Why? That's a normal name. Everyone's named Hastur around here.
It's called Hastur.
Why wouldn't you be named? It'd be like being named Pierre. Hastur Pierre, my granddad. And so the possibility of doing it in medieval Brittany or Renaissance Brittany is another strong opportunity. And then you could do crossovers with Clark Ashton Smith's Everone, which I've already done one on the C Page XX. I did a little side trip to Auvergne in 1895 for people who can't get enough Clark Ashton Smith in their life.
So I let Ken go first, so I don't have to say Brittany. And I've already done Dreamhounds of Paris, so I wouldn't do the Surrealists again with Yellowking, but that won't stop you. So the other thing I would say is the French Civil War and the suppression of the Cathars, because of course the Cathars will have come up in Paris as the inspiration for the Martinists and other occultists. The advantage of the Cathars is that all their books were burned, so you can make up whatever you want about what they believed, and so you can decide what's salubrious to you, because of course that's the whole point of being an occultist, is to make up a reality that you like better than the one that you actually live in. So I think that would be, and the Huguenot story is another huge story of horror, and because we're looking at France as well, that the French Revolution is the 1870 Revolution is big backstory in Paris, and you might want to go back to the one that non-French people know more about, and that certainly had the sense that all of reality was falling apart. Well, we've reached the top of the hour, and just as at Real Gen Con, there are people who want to use this room, specifically if you want to stick around for the next Pelgrane event. Cody Swendrowski is GMing Swords Against the Dead, starting at 6. And so you can see that go down, or you can join us tomorrow. We have a bunch of events, and now that we've figured out how to do them on Twitch, we can, as many people as want, can check in on them. So tomorrow at 2, we have the Investigative Role-Playing Masterclass. At 5, we have Ken and Robin talk about stuff live. At 8, we have the Horror Role-Playing Masterclass. Sunday at 11, we have the Dramatic Interaction Masterclass. And then at 2, there's a 13th Age Monster Creation Workshop. So at this point, I'd like to thank all of you over on the Twitch for joining us, and appreciate your coming by, and hope you enjoy your virtual Gen Con. So I don't know about you, but I'm going to go hit a virtual food truck. So everybody else, thank you so much. And let's just go around the room and tell people where we can be found. Sam, where can people find you online?
So professionally, I have a Facebook page that's just Sarah Saltiel. I also have a website with the web store where my books and art can be bought. That's sarahsamsaltiel.com. I can also be found on Twitter and Instagram as S_Saltiel and Saltiel Sarah.
Ruth, to the extent that you wish to be found, how do people find you?
They can find my role-playing and weird fiction writing at arkhamarchivist.com. And you can find me on Twitter at Ruthbrarian. That's a little more of my professional librarian type self. But yeah, Arkham Archivist for all your horror writing and some things you can buy too.
Ken?
You can follow me on Twitter or Facebook. I'm Kenneth Hite on both of those, at Kenneth Hite on the Twitters. And you can see stuff that I do and stuff that Robin does on the C Page XX newsletter on pelgranepress.com. I'd like to just a little shout out to Robert W. Chambers's nature writing. He was a woodsy guy. He was an outdoorsy guy. Those are the virtues, especially of the French and Indian War cycle. If you like Tolkien describing people walking across a woody glen, you will like Robert W. Chambers describing a upstate New York woody glen. Those are legitimately good writing. It's just that it's in between relatively pedestrian plots. So there we are.
And Woody Glenn is my favorite past member of the Baltimore Orioles. You can locate me on Twitter at Robin D. Laws, or you can find the weekly podcast that I do with Ken called Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff at kenandrobintalkaboutstuff.com, or you can support it on our Patreon. And so thanks everybody again, and we'll hopefully catch you around at other virtual Gen Con events. Thanks everybody.